Today, let's talk about one of my all-time favorite pens, and that is the Sailor Pro Gear King of Pen. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about some things that I think are interesting or unique to the Pro Gear King of Pen. I wanted to share my personal story about using this King of Pen and why I really didn't like it at first, and it took me quite a long time to bond with this pen. Um, I'll show you a bit about how it writes, um, and what I think are aspects that are fairly consistent across Sailor King of Pen nibs, and then we'll get to whether I think this pen is worth the rather steep asking price. So first off, let's just start with some things that I think are interesting or unique to the Sailor King of Pen, and the first is the size. Um, when you think of Sailor King of Pen, you're probably thinking this is a massive pen. And what I was a bit surprised to find is it's not actually that big. Um, so if you compare it to a Sailor Pro Gear, um, this might look like it's a much bigger pen, but you have to remember the Sailor Pro Gear is a pretty stubby pen. It's pretty girthy, but it's really quite short. If you compare it to something that another Japanese flat top style fountain pen like the Pilot 912, you see that the Sailor King of Pen is really not any longer. It's just a bit wider. And even if you compare it to another very common pen like a Pilot Custom 74, you see the Sailor King of Pen is actually a bit shorter than the Custom 74. So it's not as big of a pen as you might imagine. The other couple of things that I think are interesting to this pen, when I got this pen, I thought, oh, this being the flagship of Sailor's product line, it must be just so well made. The materials must be amazing, and they're not. The if you look on the finial here, you can see you can see the evidence of the glue, the residual of the glue in there. That hasn't been you know polished off or anything. It's there. It's a bit of an eyesore. You see that a bit with the threading on the back. Um, it's just regular plastic. There's absolutely nothing special about this plastic. It doesn't feel any different really to what you get in an $80 platinum Kiridas. It actually doesn't feel as nice as the plastic you get in this $160 Pilot Custom 74. I mean, just a tangent, this particular 74 I bought in Japan 6 or 7 years ago, and it was $70 or $75. So, you know, neither here or there, but the Sailor King of Pen plastic does not feel like it's substantially nicer than what I would call a fairly average, mid-tier fountain pen. What is rather unique to this pen is the nib. And if you're thinking about a Sailor King of Pen, this is probably why you're considering it. It has a very large 21 karat Sailor nib, which is very unique, not only in terms of how it looks and the fact that it's 21 karat, but it's very unique in how it writes, which I'll show you a bit later. But before that, I wanted to share with you a bit about my journey with the King of Pen. This pen means a lot to me, mainly because this was a birthday gift to me from my wife about 5 years ago. But I mentioned earlier that it took me a while to bond with this pen. And the reason is, I don't think I was ready for this pen, a pen of this caliber when I got it. At the time, the nicest pen I had in my collection was the Pilot Custom 74. And this was the pen I used every single day. And I thought a couple of things. So I thought that this Sailor King of Pen was just going to be so smooth in terms of how it wrote relative to the Pilot, which is a very, very smooth pen. And shocker, sailors have a lot of feedback. So I didn't know how to appreciate that at the time. The more important thing, though, is that I thought this pen would replace my Pilot Custom 74. I thought this would become my daily writer. Um, I thought, the Custom 74 was a demonstrator. This is a demonstrator. They're both Japanese. They're both cartridge converter pens, so that should be pretty easy to take care of. And I thought I would just use this pen as my daily writer. And that turned out to be a bit of a disaster. Um, so first of all, in this pre-COVID era, I traveled every week for work. So I was on flights multiple times a week. And this pen leaks like none other on airplanes. I think it has to do with how the section touches the cap, and how some of the ink, especially after you fill it, can sort of seep onto the section. But when you're flying in the less pressurized altitudes, ink just gushes out. So I would find all the time that when I got off the plane, there would just be ink all over the place in the cap, and it was just really messy. Um, the other thing is that the Sailor King of Pen, this 21 karat nib, is a very wet writer. Even on uh, rhodia type paper, sometimes it would feather, it would take forever to dry. If you used um, a more paper with more friction, paper that's faster drying, like Leuchtturm or like Midori, for example, it would just feather. So it wasn't the most convenient thing to be taking notes with, because you either get notes that are feathered, or you accidentally smear ink. Maybe I'm clumsy, but you would smear ink all over the page because the ink wouldn't dry. And then finally, I found the Sailor ink converter doesn't really hold enough ink for me to use this as a daily writer for 4 or 5 days straight, which is usually how long I would be away from home for when I travel. So the Pilot 74 with the Con 70, no problem. That had more than enough ink to get me through the week. But this pen, given the fact that it was a very wet writer and it's a much smaller converter, it wouldn't, it just didn't leave me with enough ink. And I ended up switching to like a pencil or a gel pen by the end of the week because this pen was out of ink. But the previous few days when I had ink, I didn't really enjoy it either because it was messy and, just a wet writer and all of that. So I didn't have a great start with this pen. It took me quite a while to realize that for me personally, the King of Pen works a lot better as something that stays at home and off airplanes for my sanity. Um, and a pen that works a lot better when I'm not in a rush to write anything, when I just want to write because I want to write. I'm writing something for none other than enjoying the pen. And when I use it for that, it makes a lot more sense. The nib is very pleasant. The wetness is really nice. And over the years, and I really mean over the years, it took me a long time to appreciate the feedback. But over the years, I've learned to really enjoy the feedback from nibs made by Sailor and Platinum. And, it's a very different feel than Pilot and some of the Western pens that I own. So that's a bit about my experience with this pen. Let me show you really briefly how this writes. And I'll try to point out some things that are common across Sailor King of Pen models. So this is Tomoe River, just loose sheaf paper. Wow, I can't talk today. And I'll just do some very simple writing. So this is a Sailor Pro Gear. This is the King of Pen. It's a medium nib. And I think the ink is Pilot. Aroshizuku. I think that's right. And it's their blue-black ink. This, so I won't talk about too much about this particular nib experience, because what I found is that with Sailor King of Pens, each one performs rather differently. They are all wet. It's probably not dry yet. Yeah, you see, even after that amount of time, it's still quite wet. They all are very wet. They all have that, pencil-like feedback, what people say, but it makes it very easy to control the writing. And they're all a bit bouncy, but they're very different in terms of the width of the line, even across medium nibs or broad nibs. And they're different in terms of how much of that feedback that they have. So this is one of those examples where it's a do what I say, not as I do a piece of advice. If you're looking at one of these, I strongly encourage you to find a reseller that will let you test out the pen. Ideally, test out several of the same pens to see and to pick one, to allow you to pick one that is more suitable to you. My wife bought this pen online, and then the other couple of Sailor King of Pens I did buy in a store in Japan, but I didn't test them out. So, don't do, excuse me, don't do as I do. But yeah, they write very differently. But in terms of common themes across them, they are soft. They have a nice bounce to them. They all have feedback, and they all write pretty wet. So that is how they write. So now let's get to the heart of the question, which is the pen worth the asking price? This is where it gets difficult for me. In the US, the Sailor King of Pen costs over $700. I think it's around $770 or something like that, even after the discounts. I think that's mainly because of how sailors are distributed in the US. Because of the distributor, I think the prices are higher. I have a really hard time recommending this pen at over $700. Like I said earlier, the quality of the materials, the quality, the build quality, it's not any nicer than pens that cost a fraction of the price. What you're really paying for is that nib. And it's a very nice nib, but is the nib alone worth that much of a premium? For me personally, I would have to say no. Now, this pen makes a lot more sense when you think about, the pricing in Asia and sort of how the pen is priced, or how it's positioned in the market, in its home market. So, my wife bought this pen in Hong Kong through one of those services. Like, someone goes to Japan, or someone in Japan buys and ships it. And I think we paid in the $3,500 Hong Kong dollars price point back when we were living in Hong Kong. That is about, at the time, I think around $425 US. In Japan, this pen retails for 60,000 Japanese yen, which is around $550. But That said, it's very common to see um, authorized retailers discounting sailors by 20 to 40%. So the street price of this pen becomes more in that, $450 price point. I think this pen makes a lot of sense at that price point. I think, the size, taking into account the fact that the materials are not anything special, but that you have a really, really nice, pleasant, unique nib. I think 400, even $450, I think it makes a lot of sense. Um, but I don't personally think um, I would be willing to pay over $700 for this pen, um, just given the build quality and what it is. But that said, this is one of my favorite pens in my collection, and I think it's a great writer. Okay, well, thanks for watching.